welcome to the North Central Climate and Drought Outlook for July of 2024. As you know, we do this every month on the third Thursday at 1 p.m. Central. Laura Edwards is the state climatologist in South Dakota. She's one of the many state climatologists that actually do this presentation, among a few others, like Dennis, who is a co-pilot here with me, Dennis Toddy from the USDA Climate Hub. So thanks to both of you for being on, and everybody in the audience as well. We do at the end do question and answer type dialogue. So if you have questions or comments as we go along, forget about the chat and just put them in the question place, so we can look at all those as we go along and get back to you. So I'm going to. Oh, you've got the recording going? All right, good. Thank you, Dennis. And Laura, you can take it away. So thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dennis. Or Doug and Dennis, rather. And thanks all for joining in the call today. Typically, I do the October webinar and kind of an end of season agriculture summary. So this is kind of a change of pace for me. But just fortuitously, South Dakota has had quite a bit of goings-on, let's say, in the last 30 days since the last webinar. And so certainly there's a lot to talk about all across the region, from drought to floods to severe weather and so on. So we'll start here. And this is a picture of southeastern South Dakota, the Vermilion River. That'd be south of Sioux Falls, close to the Nebraska border, some flooding over the roads, which happened just about a month ago, June 21st, 22nd, around those dates. So been fortunate to get a lot of pictures here from friends and colleagues across the region. First of all, this presentation will be recorded and available at both the Midwest and High Plains Regional Climate Centers. And the next webinar will be August 15th, the third Thursday. Zach Leeser from Missouri, he's state climatologist there, will be the presenter next month. And here on the screen, there's a host of links to a number of really great resources. Should you want to dive deeper into any of the topics here, and certainly reach out to myself, Doug, or Dennis if you have other things that you're looking for going forward that maybe you didn't catch here or interested in. On the pictures on the right here, again, this is kind of around the time of the peak flood in the Sioux Falls area, the Big Sioux River, and our Mesonet, our weather station network in South Dakota, run by SDSU, captured this on their webcams. So this station at Sioux Falls is actually in Sioux Falls at Sertoma Park, which is just a stone throw away from the Big Sioux River, at a really great outreach facility that Game Fish and Parks runs. And so this station, and there's the top picture is actually looking down at our snow ruler, which is the yellow and blue markings there, and you see the rain gauge on the right that's almost submerged in water. And then the picture on the bottom, you see that little arm sticking out with that cone pointing downwards. That's our snow depth sensor that measured actually about 2 feet 8 inches of water, almost 3 feet of water at that site when it was at the peak flood. So there's a time lapse available on social media too, if you want to check that out. So that's just one example of how extreme the flooding was in the Big Sioux River watershed, and we'll have some other pictures about that too. There's a lot going on though, outside of flooding, and just some great scenery across the region, some severe weather from our whole region, from Montana, Wyoming, all the way to Ohio, down to Kansas is the area that we cover in this webinar. So quite a large region. So we'll go over some recent conditions as far as temperature and precipitation go. I'll touch as much as I can on impacts, but they're so widespread and very diverse, but we'll touch on that, and then we'll get into the outlooks towards the end of the presentation, going out to 1 to 3 months on the long end. So certainly a lot of different skies, a lot of different landscapes across our region here. So we'll start with June with a snapshot of June temperature. Oh, this should be actually the temperature anomaly, the departure from average, how different we are from average. Sorry, the blue title is not correct. And so you can see the northern areas were a little bit cooler than average for the month of June, but the Wyoming, Colorado area, especially warm, but generally warm too through the heart of the Corn Belt up over into Michigan, up into the Great Lakes area. A handful of counties, several counties in Colorado, western Kansas, western Nebraska were in the top 10 warmest Junes on record. Denver County itself was #1 for warmest June on record. For statewide rankings, Colorado came in 3rd warmest, Wyoming 10th warmest on record. So we're seeing quite a bit of warmth there from the central Rockies area and kind of through the heart of the Corn Belt there. Looking at the year to date, so I kind of took this snapshot because we're halfway through the year, roughly speaking, and so these numbers January through June reflect the first half of the year. You see a handful of record warmest counties out in the far eastern side of our region, Michigan, Ohio area, and also Kentucky with a handful there as well. Statewide, as far as rankings go, Ohio, Illinois, Michigan, and Missouri all came in 2nd warmest as far as statewide rankings go. 3rd warmest, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. 4th warmest, Iowa and Kentucky in these regions. And we have several areas of individual counties that are coming in, top 5 warmest for the first half of the year. So I know there's some down in Kansas and all across the region, so outside of those states I just named. So really a pretty warm start to the year, and that will be reflected in some later numbers that I'll share as far as the accumulation of growing degree days when it comes to agriculture and crop progress, where that warmth has really helped crop progress and plant growth, especially in corn areas, pushing things a little bit earlier than average across much of the region. And you can see the exception to that is around the northwest part of our region here that we talk about today. Looking at precipitation, just for the month of June here, some really strong differences between east and west, or even central east and west, where we have some individual counties there in Wyoming and South Dakota. 3 counties there had their driest June on record. Some of the numbers I saw were 0.2, 0.3 of an inch for the entire month. So when those averages are typically around 3 inches for the month of June, as kind of ending their wettest time of year, typically anyway. But you see a handful of very dark green counties also, one in South Dakota, handful in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and one way over in Michigan that also recorded their record wettest June on record in 130 years of history. So really a strong difference just even across my single state of South Dakota between wettest and driest. But generally you see, the green colors, very wet conditions, that middle green shaded color, that middle green dark color is top 10 percentile, historically speaking. And a lot of those are in the top 2, 3, 4, 5 wettest Junes on record. So if they're not the record, they're very close. And just to give one example from Canton, South Dakota, which is just south of Sioux Falls, came in second wettest in the county there, in Minnehaha County, behind 2014, just 10 years prior to that. 10 years ago, they had 19.75 inches of rain, which is a lot, absolutely a lot. And 2024 came about 3 inches shy of that, just over 16 inches. So certainly a lot of water that's generated a lot of flooding concerns. So just because they're not the top ranked doesn't mean it wasn't exceptional in a lot of different ways. When we're looking at here, kind of like I did with temperature, looking at precipitation here, again, that similar area of very wet conditions in June helped to push many of those similar counties and those similar regions in South Dakota, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, all kind of over the top as far as January through June precipitation goes. So again, the darkest green colors are the record wettest first half of the year in 130 years. And a lot of those other, middle green colors, they're all in the top 10th percentile, historically speaking. So again, pretty substantial wetness there, especially in June. But that's contributed to, a number of water issues all throughout the growing season. And if some of those areas didn't have drought before, they would have been really, really, really tough shape for water. But as a lot of these areas, especially Minnesota, was coming out of drought in this time, we had that capacity to take up some of that moisture. Certainly flooding, but could have been a lot worse if we were going into this year with saturated conditions. So kind of a blessing in disguise as far as the change or conversion from drought to non-drought situation. Very similar in Wisconsin, which last year had a very significant drought in their area as well. Looking at just the last 30 days, this kind of overlaps with the graphs, the maps I just showed, but this is kind of a summary since the last webinar, where you see that string of the dark purples there from basically Sioux Falls, South Dakota, all the way across southern Minnesota to Wisconsin, and also a pretty wet area. They're also in central to east central Missouri. It's also been very wet really in the last couple of weeks since the 1st of July. And so again, a lot of water issues I think are at the heart of the story for this region. To kind of put that into perspective, not just the total amount of precipitation, but what percent of normal is that? And here we're looking at 200 to 300% in a lot of these areas, in that purple area that stretches from South Dakota across all the way over into Michigan, contrasted by, again, the very dry conditions from western South Dakota into Wyoming and parts of Montana, and kind of along that Front Range area, which has been very dry here for the last 30 days. And we've seen increased fire risk and a rapid dry down. Some issues there that are coming up with loss or reduction of forage, pasture, hay production in that area. This is typically the tail end of that wettest time of year in that April, May, June, where we get some rain in the western South Dakota area and surrounding area. So we're starting to see those impacts, even without the exceptional heat. Just the lack of rainfall has had an impact there. Looking at the temperatures, like I said, a lot of areas have been warmer than average for June, with the exception of the northwestern part of our region, northern South Dakota, North Dakota, parts of Montana. But here, just over the last 30 days, we've seen really more of those cooler temperatures coming a little further south, reaching down into Nebraska, parts of Minnesota, and so on. So not as much warmth, but the exception that's kind of hidden in the kind of a devil in the details here, is we did have a very extreme warm event just over this last weekend with a lot of very high temperatures, 100 plus across much of this region, at least the western states of this region, and not a lot of records set, but a handful of them that I'll share with a little bit later. So that's really been, though, kind of the peak heat of the season just over this last weekend. Again, has not been extremely hot, but we've seen some steady warmth across, again, the southern states and south and eastern side of our region. Kind of translating all of this into soil moisture, and we'll talk about drought here also. Here's a ranking percentile, so kind of how we compare to this time of year as far as soil moisture goes. And this is this one model from the Climate Prediction Center, where you can look at daily updates, monthly, and so on. Certainly reflecting the very wet conditions in the northern part of our region and the dryness that's kind of contrasted there in far eastern part of the region over Ohio, and then the far western part of the region from South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, and westward. So kind of a tale of two regions in some ways as far as we're looking at this region so far. So here's the drought monitor that was, at least for our region, released this morning. And so currently across the whole region here, we have 14% of the area in drought. That's D1 or moderate drought or worse on this map. Just about 3%, a little over 3% in the D2 severe drought category, and a very small area in western Montana now with the D3 or extreme drought. So that's a pretty rare event. When you get into the D3 category, you're looking at, you know, something in that 5th percentile or so. So really quite extreme conditions out there in western Montana. And there again, very similar to the soil moisture map I showed, no drought over kind of the heart of our region here. And just to compare that to a month ago, of the last, when the last webinar was held, this is looking at how many categories, drought categories, has the drought monitor changed in the last 4 weeks or last month. And so this is kind of looking at the trend of change in drought here, with increasing severity and increasing in extent or area of dryness or drought, especially over the western states, western part of our region, I should say, all the way down to the Front Range of Colorado, and also in the far eastern part of Ohio and Kentucky. We have general improvements, again, reflecting some gains in moisture and rainfall across the central part of the state. Some of that has been, you know, thunderstorms, severe weather, but some of it has been extreme precipitation, and some of it has been an artifact of Tropical Storm Beryl when that came through the region that brought some beneficial rain following some dry period in some of the Illinois area, in particular Illinois to Indiana area. Comparing this to last year this time, there's been a lot of talk of kind of this midsummer checkpoint, you know, where we're looking at corn pollination, crop progress, and it's kind of a peak time where people are really concerned about, or really thinking about drought. And so you can see really big differences here, you know, 4 or 5 classes change in drought monitor compared to a year ago this time in the all through the middle part of our region here. So it's really been a very big flip, you could say, from very dry to excess wet conditions through the Missouri River Basin, Mississippi River Basin, in this part of the country, at least, where we've had the increasing drought again. That's really not just been the last month, you know, but has been developing over the last year, as we saw some increases in drought even in the wintertime last winter. So really quite a stark change over that time. So looking at some climate impacts, and we have quite a lot here. First of all, just looking at the flooding, I've kind of alluded to this. A couple of pictures to share here. The first on the left is the Locken Dam #1 in the Mississippi River, which is upstream of the Twin Cities, taken at the end of June. Yeah, typically those trees, aren't up to their necks in water in the Mississippi River. Looking at again the Mississippi on the top right at La Crosse, Wisconsin. That's the beach house there that's up to its feet in water there. The Mississippi River there had some extreme high levels. I think top 7 highest level over 14 feet there that Jeff had shared from the National Weather Service, and also some more localized flooding too, as in Western Kentucky University had some flooding earlier this month, and a handful of other places with a lot of flash flooding going on with extreme precipitation events throughout the region. And taking a snapshot of maybe one of the larger stories of the last month that happened again, and just after the last webinar, around June 22nd, 23rd, 24th is about when we saw the peak. But this is looking at a Landsat image from June 9th for southeastern South Dakota and Nebraska and Iowa. So South Dakota is this part between the Missouri and the Big Sioux River. Iowa there is to the east, Nebraska to the south of the Missouri section here. And you see the string, that's the Missouri River, the Big Sioux River there, the Floyd River that flows into Sioux City as well. And next I'll share, this is the Landsat image on June 24th, just around the peak flood region. So you can see just how widespread the flooding was in the Big Sioux River in particular, Floyd River, the tributaries in Iowa, and all these low spots in South Dakota. You'll see this kind of loop down here, and you guys may have heard of McCook Lake that also flooded and scoured out quite a bit of area. May have heard of a railroad bridge that was also broken and up to the bottom in water, and then eventually fell in. That was also down in this lower part of the Big Sioux River also. So quite substantial infrastructure impacts. As far as agriculture impacts outside of the flooded area of land, of course, we did see some livestock losses with high water, flooding issues there, and also some impacts on the recreation side. There's a number of state parks, other campgrounds, and other recreation activities, fishing on the river access, that was all affected by this flood of last month of June. I know some of those are still ongoing with standing water in some of those areas. So I think the crop losses aren't quite all determined yet. And also a number of houses that were also inundated, and in some areas that were flooded there as well, especially in Iowa. So I know they're still making disaster lists of impacts and the full cost of that, but we're looking in the hundreds of millions of dollars at the least from the starting point. So just looking at stream flow for the last 28 days, I know this doesn't really tell a lot of the story, but we still see flood levels in parts of the upper Mississippi River Basin. Not so much on the Missouri River Basin at this time, but you see a lot of the blues and black dots are much above to very high near record in some of these areas for the average stream flow for the last 28 days. And that goes clear up to the Canada border, where we've seen some very high lake levels in contrast to lake levels of a year ago. And that goes from the Canada border all the way down to northern Iowa. When I mentioned recreational impacts, there are a number of lakes that have docks submerged, high water along shorelines. They're providing rules for no wake zones, basically no waves behind boating, low speed limits, like 5 miles an hour on speed limits, so that some of that infrastructure right along the shoreline does not get damaged anymore by wave action. And so I've heard reports all the way from Lake Okoboji all the way up to Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota of these kinds of impacts. So certainly that's something on recreation that's been a factor as a result of the heavy rainfall. So here, this is another side of the story here, and I've kind of mentioned some rainfall that came with severe weather. This is a look at the issuances of severe weather warnings by the weather forecast offices, the WFOs from the National Weather Service all across the country. And so looking at how many events did they warn for severe thunderstorms or tornadoes, okay? And so you see some really big numbers there, in the 400s, 300s, 400s in the Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Iowa area. Certainly that's kind of the heart of where it's been very active throughout the last, then this is through the season so far, so January through yesterday. But how do you know, well, gosh, what's normal for that? Well, let's see how different that is from average. So here you can see how many more or less warnings each one of those forecast offices has issued as compared to average. And so certainly the Omaha Valley office in eastern Nebraska, the Quad Cities looks like in eastern Iowa have had over 200 more warnings of severe thunderstorm and tornadoes than they have in a typical year. And then also note it's been very quiet from kind of southwestern Minnesota, eastern South Dakota, and up north there. A fair number of fewer than average severe storm and tornado warnings as compared to average. And then down in Kentucky, very similar story. So a really uneven distribution, let's say, of severe weather across the region. And we can look at that in one way, looking at the tornado reports for the year so far. All those red dots, each one of those red dots shows a tornado that was reported. This is from the Storm Prediction Center as of yesterday. And so Ohio's had 64 tornadoes so far. You can see they're kind of a hot spot over there, which is, I believe, a near record. Indiana has been relatively quiet, but they did have tornadoes way down in southwestern Indiana. I believe Gibson County had a very damaging tornado over some farmland and some farm homes and farmsteads. And again, you see that string of them from eastern Nebraska all the way across Iowa into northern Illinois. And even just recently, a few days ago, there was the derecho event that's kind of shared by Iowa, Illinois, that ended up with some tornadoes as well in the Chicagoland area. So definitely a high profile event in a highly populated area with a handful of tornadoes out there. So very active, severe weather season for some. But, look up in the Dakotas, Minnesota, it's been very quiet, severe weather-wise, with only 4 tornadoes in South Dakota. I think we're at kind of the lowest of all the states, except maybe Wyoming there. So really quite quiet up our way. And here's just a brief little summary from the National Weather Service in Chicago area, just summarizing the tornado activity from earlier this week, July 14th and 15th, where they have determined at least 25 tornadoes within a 48 period there in northern Illinois and northwestern Indiana. So certainly with that number of tornadoes, or at least, it'll take a little while for them to complete all their damage assessments and reports, but you can see on the left image there, you know, at least a few storm tracks went right through the Chicago metro area, and then again on the 15th, a number in the Chicago land area as well. So very busy season, a very busy week, I should say, for the Chicago National Weather Service office. So kind of changing tracks here, I had mentioned how warmer than average temperatures for the season of the year so far has contributed to crop progress and crop growth a little bit ahead of average this year. And so that can be reflected in growing degree days. So this is information from USDA, from the Office of Chief Economist. All those areas in the orange are warmer than average for growing degree days so far from April 1st through July 13th, so up until a few days ago. Up in the north still lagging behind average for this time of year in that kind of purpley color. So again, slower crop progress in the north, as I can attest to up here, but we had some areas in Illinois that had, or I want to say Illinois or Iowa, I think, had sweet corn even ready by July 4th, which is pretty early for this time of year, but they did have some insect disease or insect issues in that crop. And just touching on the last 7 days over the weekend, we had some a string of days with record temperatures or near record temperatures. This is just showing the Front Range area or the states of Wyoming and Colorado where we saw kind of those more record events. So in the Denver area for the last 7 days, that is their hottest period for July 11th to 17th, so for that week. But a number of areas coming in second, you know, third, fourth, top five in the red colors. So really quite extreme temperatures for this time of year, but not all record breaking outside of just a couple locations. Other highlights, I guess, here on the agriculture side, wheat harvest, wheat harvest progress ahead of average, again, partly driven by those above average temperatures, drought affecting, you know, the western side of the state. Another issue too, maybe not agriculture related directly, but looking at harmful algal bloom forecast for Lake Erie, as of the end of June, appeared to be the risk something close to what they saw last year. But if rainfall and runoff are above average in July, that could kind of raise that risk again in the month of August. So something to keep an eye on out there. Now looking at the outlooks. Jumping ahead, we don't have El Nino at play, but La Niña is coming, and it's been kind of a slower start than we had thought it would be, but by all accounts, it's on its way, and so that does have a factor, or does play a role in the outlooks in the longer periods in the 1 to 3 month outlook. But we'll start with the next 7 days to start with here. We're looking at precipitation. Total precipitation by one forecast here, kind of that hot, the wet spot over central and eastern Nebraska, but generally a little bit less activity here, a little bit quieter as far as total amounts. Even the blue colors, we're looking at, you know, an inch or less for most of those areas, with the exception of kind of those real wet areas in central Nebraska. And as we jump out ahead 8 to 14 days, we have temperatures favored to be above average here for the last week of July, the 25th to 31st, in just those same areas that have been kind of behind on growing degree days and a little cooler on the temperature. So maybe they'll have some time to catch up here with temperatures, maybe something near to cooler than average when you look down into southwestern Kansas and southern Missouri, again, that 1 to 2 week time period. Along hand in hand with that on the precipitation outlook for 8 to 14 days is on the right side, with generally drier than average favored over the northern Rockies, northern Plains area, and potentially a little more active weather pattern there for kind of the central and eastern part of our region, from kind of central Iowa and eastward across our region. For the month of August, the update that came out this morning generally leans towards warmer all across the lower 48, with the exception of the far west coast. But we see kind of a couple bullseyes, one over the Rockies, over the Wyoming, Colorado, Utah area, and then another kind of bullseye over the mid-Atlantic region. And so a lot of us are somewhere in the middle, but in general, favoring warmer than average temperatures for the month ahead. And on the right side, precipitation slightly leaning towards drier in much of the western side of our region. So that could be exacerbating our existing drought conditions, could be intensifying or expanding some of those areas, which is reflected in the seasonal drought outlook, which I don't have to share. I did not put on here to share today, but looking at potential expansion or worsening of drought in the western side of our region as a result of this outlook and others. And August through October, you know, generally looking at warmer favored across the region, again, particularly the Rockies side of Wyoming and Colorado, a little lower probabilities up until you get to the northern part there of North Dakota, Minnesota. Equal chances now favored, so equal chances of warmer, cooler, or near average temperature for August through October now in the outlook. And then on precipitation on the right side, generally slightly leaning towards drier across much of our region, from Iowa, Minnesota westward, with kind of the highest probability or highest confidence there, right over the areas favored to be warmer over Wyoming, Colorado, and then into Utah in the western region. So something to keep an eye on. It looks like we'll be kind of continuing a trend. You know, a handful of states in our region have had year to year and a half long records of continuous months above average temperature. And it looks like that trend may continue as we look into the fall season. So with that, Doug, I have some contact information for some of us here. I did get some agriculture information from Brad Rippey at USDA. I thank all my colleagues and friends for sharing some pictures and impacts with us. I know there's a lot to report here, so happy to take questions.
Yep, thank you. And I'm going to thank you, Laura. There was way too much to report this month. You know, a lot of factoids and a lot of records set in the West, in Wyoming and Colorado that we really didn't get to in terms of heat. And I'm actually going to share something hot off the press that I just got an email for. So stand by. Let me see if this works. And this is calling for excessive heat just north of you, Laura. And this is our hazard outlook. Hopefully you can see this. It's calling for excessive heat the 26th, 27th, 28th, way the heck up north there. Doesn't mean it's going to necessarily be warmer than it is in Texas. Actually, maybe this time of year. But this is a hazard thing that just came out. That yellowy line in there, that kind of tan line is, or shape, I should say, is an area that could also go into drought, increase drought pretty rapidly over the next week or two as well. Do you want to say anything about that, Laura, that drought, that potential drought area?
Yeah, you know, I think that area has been on a list that people have been watching pretty closely. I know I have, with a number of other kind of drought monitor type people. You know, it's kind of at a tipping point, really following a really dry June. And now that we've had some heat, I think that could be accelerating some of the drought development there.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one of the worries. That ridge building back in the west again could happen. The other thing I wanted to show, because Laura didn't show it, is the seasonal outlook for drought. There it is, very shortly. All that yellow area out there on this map, I'm sorry, indicates an area where by the end of October, basically, there's a good chance of drought development in that region, partially because of antecedent conditions, but also because of the outlook over the next 3 months. So, well, I did want to show this drought outlook image, and Laura just didn't have time to put it in there. So anyway, I'll leave that. Whoops, I just blew it up. I'll just leave it there, and now we can get to the questions. Dennis, do you have a handle on those questions? Do you want to start?
Sure. Okay. The first one, there was a question about the precip ranking in Crowley County in Colorado. Laura, I'm sure you know exactly where Crowley County is, correct?
Not quite, no.
Anyway, it was a question referring to the June precipitation ranking, and it maybe didn't quite line up with what the questioner was asking. And I tried to go in and chime in that the June ranking for precipitation from the co-op station was a bit higher than average for that station. The other thing I want to mention about those maps, Mary Beth, is that they are not, they use point data to create a gridded field, and then they give a ranking for the county based on that gridded data. So even though a point in there may say one thing, what it says for the county based on this gridded data may show somewhat different. And I did look at stations around there, and stations around the county were also higher than average. So that may be what is causing your county to come in higher than maybe you expected to in the ranking. So.
And maybe the other thing to mention really quickly is in drier areas, it doesn't take a lot more precipitation to bump you up to above normal. You know, the difference between half an inch can make a difference in some places in the West. Not being familiar with that county, by the way.
Yeah, I just took a peek, Dennis, while you were talking, and June looks like it came in 1.83 inches for that county, ranking 90 out of 130, so 40th wettest on record.
Not super wet then.
Okay. Okay, we've got a couple questions here on, Laura, specifically about what kind of impacts on crop because of the excessive rains and flooding in South Dakota. And then there was a general question about how much yield loss we're going to expect from this wetness. So Laura, why don't you go ahead and take off, and then we'll add on pieces as we go.
Sure. Yeah. You know, in the areas that flooded and receded pretty quickly, we don't anticipate, you know, a lot of yield loss there. You know, I did see some yellowing corn. I was down that way just a week ago, and did see some areas that are probably pretty much gone, even though they don't have water in them anymore. But it kind of comes down to how long do you have standing water in the field? Did you have moving water, you know, across the field? And kind of the crop stage as well, where some of that corn was kind of decently far along, not quite tasseling, but tall enough, strong enough to tolerate some water, where soybeans have been lagging behind. So maybe a little worse for wear down there. I don't know that we have a good handle yet on the crop losses You know, I think a lot of that's going to have to wait a while for it to play out. You know, we've had kind of a string of drier weather the last 2 weeks in that area, so things could be turning, kind of rebounding back. You know, as far as some other areas that haven't had as much flooding but have been wet, I've heard pretty good things as far as like tree fruit crops go, things like that can tolerate a little more water, assuming they weren't submerged. But yeah, I think, Dennis, it's a little too early to tell, as this was just, you know, 3 weeks ago at this point.
Yeah, and the other thing is, Dennis, maybe you want to mention state crop numbers, because you can look at individual areas or counties and it may look very, very bad, but for a state, it may not be, or a region.
Yeah, Laura didn't have the NASS report maps, but generally corn and soybeans, because those are the two commonly grown ones, are 68% good to excellent all across the corn and soybean areas. The northern areas that have been a little bit wetter and a little bit cooler, the numbers are a little bit lower, but they're still not too bad for this time of year. And that's the thing you have to remember. While the excess precipitation has done some damage in some areas, lots of other areas are getting a lot of rainfall. So so far the crop conditions are generally very good. Wet periods, you know, wetter years are not big yield loss years. 1993 is the one exception to that. Generally, you have good yields, but they're just harder to deal with. It's the big drought years that you see big yield hits.
And maybe fold that into severe weather too, Dennis, in terms of how severe, like hail and wind, or tornadoes for that matter, have affected crops.
Right. Yeah. There's been plenty of hail. We're starting to get some reports back from the derecho on how much crop damage there was. It's still too early to say much about that, because in some cases the corn may be leaning, but it can pull itself back up still. There has been some hail loss, we know that, but again, from an overall scale, it's probably going to be relatively small in the scale of the whole crop. You know, crops being in pretty good condition overall. It's an unfortunate loss for them, but from a wider scale, I don't think we're looking at major yield losses at this point.
Yeah, Dennis, I agree with that. I think Nebraska had maybe the largest area of hail damage. But even with the tornadoes in northern Illinois earlier this week, it seems pretty localized, where they had the worst, you know, moderate to severe damage, either wind or hail. So the only issue with the wetness, though, on the crops is increased disease. So quite a few reports in multiple states about increasing cases of tar spot, southern rust, those kinds of things, which the climate has been favorable for those kinds of plant diseases.
Yeah, there's a question also about increases in West Nile or I'll say tick-borne or other diseases from it'll say insects. I know you said something about that in South Dakota now, Laura, but I don't have a good feel for the rest of the region other than wetness does. Oh, there are a lot of mosquitoes in Minnesota. What's new? But I guess they're doubled. No, there's a lot more.
Yeah, I think at least anecdotally, I've heard reports of increased numbers of mosquitoes in general this year as compared to normal. We have had I think 2 West Nile virus positives in South Dakota. I don't know about the other states, but typically, you know, West Nile virus is more a concern in drought years, surprisingly, because the pools are concentrated, and for some reason we see more West Nile virus cases in the dry years than the very wet years. But yeah, we have a lot of mosquitoes out there all across the region.
What it was described to me is the mosquito that carries West Nile virus likes cleaner pools of water, so they tend to flourish during those dry years in pools that appear fairly quickly and then disappear. Nuisance mosquitoes are, you know, ones we get when you have large spread standing water, and like Laura and Doug have both just said, plenty of mosquitoes this year, more widespread.
Great question, Doug, about, and we didn't cover this. Whoops, am I still there? Am I still
Yep.
on?
We hear you.
Okay. I somehow hit something and my computer went dark. The great question about the Ohio River and actually the Mississippi in terms of navigation, and we didn't cover it and we should have. The fact that the Missouri and upper Mississippi are flowing well is going to alleviate much of the stress on the Ohio. The Ohio seems to be, if you will, holding its own in terms of navigation and water. So the fear that we had 2 months ago or so about another year of low water in lower Mississippi for barges and getting moving things up and down the river is somewhat alleviated. The driest time, minimum flows generally are late September and October. So we'll keep watching it through then. But as of now, we're in a much better shape. Greg Gust, thanks, Greg. Find the most probable dates of extreme northern heat with the probability of extremes. Okay. I have reports of 5 inches of rain in 45 minutes. Yes, we've heard a lot of that. Where can we get details on this? Oh, so Kevin, one of the best places to contact, one of the most is your state climatologist, and that's Steve Valveris. And I don't have his email handy, but maybe someone can put it in there. And he or they, he has a climate office there, can get you some of those values. If not, you can write back to any of us, ask us this question, and we'll find the right people to get you that. There is a Midwestern Regional Climate Center that also has those values on hand. But I'd rather have you go to the state climatologist to start with on a question like that. What factors are considered an rapid onset drought risk? Hey, can you sum that up in a couple sentences, Laura, in terms of rapid onset drought risk? What flash drought?
Yeah, so generally it's a period, usually starts at below average moisture, much below average moisture, and can be accelerated by warmer than average temperatures, but often leads to rapidly drying conditions. And this time of year, we can see that as we're kind of in our wetter time of year for some parts of the region. And those impacts grow very quickly as well. So I'm not quite sure, in this map, Doug, how CPC defines that, if they're looking at, some drought monitor category change over some period of time, over like 2 weeks or something. But
Yep. So I think the area cannot be currently in drought, or else it can't be in drought for this color to show up. So if it's a D0, which is not drought, by the way, it's just anomalous dryness. It's not in D1 or worse. It's eligible to be rapid onset drought.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So wind, as you said, wind, low humidity, and above normal temperatures tend to help that all happen.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on. Dennis, what kind of crop are we looking at across the Corn Belt? I think we said good, even with severe weather. Doug, can you throw back up? Okay, I did that. How has weather affected grasshoppers and damages? They are horrible in the east central part of, El Paso County in Colorado, if someone knows where that is. Generally speaking, when it's dry, grasshoppers are worse, and I'm sure there's a season for that, especially in the West. So it doesn't surprise me that the pressure, I can't remember what Russ, the state climatologist in Colorado, said in terms of areas of super dry this year. Do you remember that, Laura?
It's kind of the north central, like the northern Front Range.
That's right along the Front Range.
Yep.
And I think he said there were some other areas in the southeast that were showing some drought stress.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, kind of adjoining Kansas area.
2 counties south of Denver. That would make sense. Thank you. does temperature when water is standing in crops have an effect on the amount of damage and how soon damage occurs? So that's an interesting thing. So if it gets hot when there's standing water, does that matter?
I don't know. You can ask Dennis too. I don't think it matters as much as the submerged roots matters more.
Okay.
I think there's a little bit of a time factor, but Laura's right. It's how long you're in water, and in how saturated you are for a period of time. That's the biggest driver.
Oh yes, and someone is pointing out, thanks, Chip. One of the silver linings of drought, at least in central Kentucky, and I'm sure in other places, you don't have to mow your yard as much. He hasn't had to mow since late May. Anyway, I'm going to say thank you to everybody. It's almost 2 o'clock. I'm going to give you less than 2 minutes back. I want to thank Laura and Dennis and everybody who was on this again. We'll do this again in August, third Thursday, 1 p.m. Central, with Zach Leeser. It'll be his first time. He's out of Missouri, but he knows a lot, and we'll make it really hard on him. No, just kidding. Thanks, everybody, and see you next month. And Laura, I do need your final, actually, Dennis and I both need your final PowerPoint presentation. Thank you.
Okay, yep.